In this segment, I want to discuss the issue of cultural change. This has been a theme that has been carried out throughout the course, going all the way back to prehistory. Why have cultures changed? But I've not addressed it very directly until now. When we talk about cultural change, it's hard to avoid the issue of whether revolution or evolution produce the most long-lasting cultural change. It's tempting to think that revolution will provide the change, and this is particularly true for Americans because of the popularity of the idea of revolution. The United States started with a revolution, and we celebrate the onset of that revolution every July 4th. And we count that revolution as a success. People point with great pride to the American Revolution and to the follow-on Constitution that was drafted a few years after the War for Revolution was completed. But this is deceptive. Of all the revolutions that have occurred, some of which have been attempted and failed, some of which have seemed to succeed for a few years, there's a real question as to whether they've succeeded at all. There's a good question as to whether revolution is a way in which cultural change can effectively be brought about. So I'd like to review a few of the so-called successful revolutions to show, or to attempt to show, how limited their success has been. When we talk about revolutions, putting aside minor insurgencies, coups d'etats, events like that, we want to talk about grand revolutions, revolutions which set out to change the culture and seem to do so for a limited period of time. In discussing these, I want to talk about the English Revolution, which is officially dated 1620, 1640 to 1660. I give a wide range because some of these had preliminary activities that were, in a sense, revolutionary. I want to talk about the American Revolution, which I will date from 1776 all the way to the end of the War of 1812 in 1815, because the War of 1812 is arguably a second phase in that revolutionary activity. The French Revolution, which dated from 1789 until the fall of Napoleon in the early 1800s, 1812 to 1815, and then the Russian Revolution of 1917, which I will date all the way to the end of the communist period in 1990, and the Chinese Revolution, which I'll date from 1912, when the Chinese imperial house fell, until 1980, when Deng Xiaoping was fully in power, because I see that as the end of the Chinese Revolution. Now, these are very long dates, but I think the only way to really understand cultural change and the impact of revolutions is by using these longer dates. Because if we use short dates, we have a misapprehension that revolution succeeded. Now, it is true in each of these revolutions that there was a period of time when revolutionary forces overthrew a previous ruling group or class and put themselves in power. But you know, in every case they didn't stay in power, and they reverted to some other kind of a regime. So let's take a look at each one of these briefly. I'm not positioned to give a complete revolutionary review, but let's take a look at what happened in the English Civil War. We started with Charles I. There was a lengthy conflict that ended in a trial and an execution of Charles I. But not long after he was executed, the forces of restoration came back into power and put Charles I's son, Charles II, back on the throne. And he proceeded to execute those who had executed his father. Probably not very surprising that he would do that, but it indicates how limited was their revolutionary activity. Now, some will say, well, the ideas of the revolution then became ideas within the country, and that may be true. But there are other events, evolutionary events, that have the same consequence, and we don't typically call on them as a success. I can't call the English Civil War and Revolution a success. It failed. The Protectorate failed, and a monarchy was put back in place, and the monarchy has continued in place ever since. The French Revolution is another example of someone where we started with a monarchy of Louis XVI and ended up with a monarchy with the return of the Bourbon House. And along the way, we had another monarch called Napoleon I. How is that a successful overthrowing of a monarchy? There is no monarchy in France today, but you know, curiously, if you look at French government with this very strong presidential power, it merely looks like another monarch. To be sure, one that's elected to frequent terms, but a president who, while in power, has very substantial powers. The American Revolution, sandwiched between these two, looks different. It is frequently noted that the American Revolution was not a revolution in which the existing class was overthrown, the existing ruling class was overthrown, but as a colonial separation. It's true that some of the ruling elite in the colonial government fled the country. The Tories, many of the Tories fled. Some stayed behind, having their property confiscated and living not very happily under the new regime. But the American Revolution always looks more limited than the English Civil War, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution. So it becomes an odd case. Popular for Americans, but not very telling on a global scale for how much cultural change. Indeed, one can argue that the American Revolution ended up being a continuation of the kind of cultural history that was a part of Great Britain, and that much of our legal system, many of our constitutional principles, are all principles that came from Great Britain. So that the amount of cultural change as a result of the revolution was fairly small. Now let's take a little longer look at the Russian Revolution, and the argument I make that the Russian Revolution has to be considered over a much longer time frame. Typically, the Russian Revolution is said to start in 1917 and end, I suppose, about 1925. But you know, that's not very helpful, because in fact, you could argue that there was a temporary regime, a regime of Stalin and his successors Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and some others, ending finally with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. If you take this kind of a time frame, what can we see as the effect of the Russian Revolution? Well, the effect of the Russian Revolution was we got rid of the Tsar, and we got rid of those people who were aristocrats within that government. But did we change the underlying cultural system? Well, that's far from clear. There certainly are some who would argue today that Vladimir Putin looks more like a Russian Tsar than anything else. Oh, to be sure, he was elected. There was an election, and he was elected and limited to 2 terms, so he was elected twice and held it. And then, of course, his place was taken by someone else, someone he handpicked to fill the position while he occupied another position in the government until it was time for him to make a comeback, which he's done. Now, that's not technically the same as the Tsar, who had a hereditary right to the office of Tsar, but it sure looks like a very Tsar-like government, and a number of events in Russian history suggest that the behavior of Putin looks an awful lot like the behavior of Tsars. And what about the Chinese Revolution? Well, the Chinese Revolution is dated from the late fall of 1911, when the Chinese imperial system collapsed. The Chinese emperor, a young boy who almost certainly didn't know what he was doing, signed away his powers, and the imperial system ended officially on January 1, 1912. There then was a period in which various warlords sought to take control of China. One of them, Yuan Shikai, was in power briefly and might have succeeded in placing himself as a new emperor of China had he not died. Once he died, another struggle among a bunch of armed groups called warlords continued for a number of years until 1925, when one of those warlords, Chiang Kai-shek, emerged as the first among equals. I say that because, in fact, he never really consolidated his control so that he was totally in control of the government. And it would not be fair to say that he had become a new Chinese emperor. Indeed, challenges to his authority went on throughout the whole period when he was in power, because he was challenged almost from the beginning by communist forces who ultimately prevailed, forced him to flee the mainland of China to the island of Formosa, now called Taiwan, where he continued his regime until his death, and was succeeded by various leaders who came out of his political party. What about the Communist Revolution? Well, the Communist Revolution arguably started in the early 1930s. It was almost decimated by Chiang Kai-shek, but it managed to hang on. In 1935, it began a long march. The long march went on for over a year and traversed several thousand miles, a few thousand miles, 3,000 or 4,000 miles. And then a small group, possibly 4,000, possibly 10,000, led by Mao Zedong, created a safe haven for the communists in a comparatively remote and inhospitable part of China. Starting in 1935 and running for the next 14 years, they engaged in a long civil war, which was paralleled the Japanese war against the Chinese. That period of great turmoil ended finally in 1949 with the success of the Communist Party. So one would be tempted to say the revolution was over when the People's Republic of China was proclaimed on October 1, 1949. But this is somewhat deceptive. It is true Mao Zedong came to power. It is true that the revolutionary leaders who followed him replaced all of the old elite. It is true that any of the nationalists who were left over were imprisoned, as far as we know, if they weren't killed, and that Mao Zedong was securely in power from 1949 until his death in early September of 1976. So we had a successful revolution. Or did we? I say that because Maoism, and I previously opined that Maoism had a lot of Confucianism in it, was really an extreme form within the Chinese traditional system. As hard as I have looked at Mao Zedong, I find only a superficial Marxist-Leninist rhetoric attached to it. Indeed, the Soviet Union, the leaders of the Soviet Union from 1957 on were very critical of Mao and were convinced he was not a Marxist-Leninist. And I think they were right. I think he was Chinese, first and foremost. And his Marxist-Leninism was a mere rhetorical flourish. But what happened when Mao died? Well, when Mao died, Maoism itself died almost immediately. It's true, when Mao died, his hand-picked successor, Hua Guofeng, came to power, but he only managed to hang on to power for about 3 years before he was displaced by Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping, who never claimed to be the top leader in China, though he was in fact the top leader of China, hung on for another 20 years, almost 20 years, before his own death.